Hi everybody, thank you for joining Deb and myself today. Hope you're all doing well. I was going to say it's nearly Friday, but no, it's not quite yet. So for the next hour or so, we are going to have a little bit of a look at how to make the most of a workplace needs assessment and how, more importantly, to sort of implement adjustments effectively. Okay. Um, We are going to have some time at the end for questions and answers. So please, if you do have any questions as we go through this, please just type them into the Q&A window as we go, and we'll have a chance at the end to review and catch up with those. But before we jump into that, let's just first introduce ourselves. So my name is Mark Woodward. I've been with neurobox now for a few years, and I've been in the neurodiversity space for more years than I want to work out. I'm a workplace needs assessor, I'm a coach, I'm a coaching supervisor. Nowadays, I spend most of my time sort of working with organisations, looking at sort of bigger picture type stuff, and heading up Neurobox's workplace adjustment service. And I work closely with Deborah.
Hi everyone, thanks Mark. Hi, great to be with you all today. Not quite Friday, but it's Wednesday, I think, yes. My name's Deborah. I'm the head of research here at Neurobox. I have a research background in dyslexia, specifically in creative practice. I'm a practitioner as well as an academic, and my background is as a needs assessor, a strategy coach, a study skills tutor in higher education, and also a university lecturer. Along with Mark, we all have many hats in the organisation, one of which for me is developing and implementing our research strategy and our approach, some of which involves our impact evaluation, developing insight panels, internal knowledge exchange, and also working with our fabulous research partners. So with that, I'm going to provide you with a little bit of an introduction and overview to what to expect from our time together. Mark and I have created a fictionalized narrative case study called Sophie, and she's going to help us basically to tell the story of this workplace needs assessment journey. We're going to talk about the current landscape, what's going on in the adjustment world, workplace needs assessments, screening tools, implementing adjustments. All of it is up for discussion, and there's a lot to talk about. We're going to kind of ground the discussion is, essentially what is a workplace needs assessment that we're talking about? What are the benefits? What other models of delivering adjustments exist? And crucially, it's a really important question, are workplace needs assessments still relevant in the current age? And lastly, really importantly, how to implement adjustment recommendations. Before we move into frequently asked questions, as Mark said, please do keep the questions coming in the Q&A function. We have a section towards the end dedicated to your questions, and we also have some questions already prepped for you as well. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Mark to introduce Sophie.
Okay, so meet Sophie, our pretend made-up person. So Sophie's an analyst. She's really good at her role. She works for a national utilities company. Sophie is known for being sort of meticulous in her work. She values structure and is good at her job. But she's also exhausted. Sophie's constantly masking. She forgets verbal instructions quite regularly, and she's increasingly anxious before sort of meetings and so on and so forth. Something's not working for Sophie. Sophie's been in a role for around 2.5 years. She suspects that she may be neurodivergent, neurodifferent, but she hasn't got any formal diagnosis. Sophie hasn't mentioned anything yet. She's worried how it might look, how she might be perceived. She's worried that she may come across as being not so good at her job. And at the moment, the sort of risks of sharing and asking for support for Sophie kind of sort of outweigh the potential benefits. On top of that, asking for support is going to take time, and it's probably something else that Sophie's got to manage that she could do without at the moment. So Deb's going to give us a little bit more insight into some of those sorts of challenges, if you like.
Thank you, Mark. So, Sophie is right to be concerned about the time and the potential emotional energy required to, first of all, ask for adjustments and to wait for them to be implemented. We can see through recent research done by City and Guilds and also the Great Big Adjustment Survey, the length of time that people wait for adjustments. The first stat we have is that 14% of employees wait between 3 months and over a year to receive adjustments. And the adjustment survey suggests that 1 in 8 disabled employees are still waiting after a full year. Now, this may or may not be because these adjustments are dependent on access to work, and we know, of course, there is a systemic problem with access to work for the last couple of years in terms of the turnaround time. But there can also be other reasons, other barriers for these very long wait times to implement adjustments. And I think that is potentially one of the reasons why there is a really important and interesting debate going on about whether traditional workplace needs assessments, whether that's delivered through access to work or through occupational health or a workplace adjustment provider, whether these needs assessments are really still the best way to support employees. We know, of course, that there's rising pressures on HR budgets, and there are many options for streamlining, for want of a better word, adjustments. And it's easy to see why this question of the relevance of workplace needs assessments is being asked. And it's certainly something that, as a team, we talk about a lot. It's really current for us. If somebody needs, excuse me, if someone needs noise cancelling headphones or speech to text software, do we need to go through a formal process? Shouldn't these adjustments just be available by default when we think about, of course, universal design? Essentially, we're looking less at kind of ad hoc adjustments or requesting adjustments because they are just available as part of the organizational culture, system, etc. And we know that these adjustments should be, of course, being embedded into kind of day-to-day practice so that there's not that friction or that delay. But that isn't always the case. There's not always the kind of budget in place or the apparatus, if you like, the process, the procedure. And there's lots of options, to think about. Some organisations have kind of explored or do explore a kind of triage system that Mark's going to talk about a little bit later. Might be a quick phone call or an online tool that can kind of fast track those adjustments. And we believe wholeheartedly that as part of, I think, a broader package of support, that these approaches can be useful in certain scenarios. But we're also interested in looking at what is that kind of more holistic journey like for that individual. So part of this talk, as well as thinking about the implementation of adjustments, it's really thinking about what is a workplace needs assessment, and essentially what is its value? How can we make it work for us? And with that, I'm going to hand over to Mark to talk about what is a workplace needs assessment.
Thank you, Deb. So let's move Sophie's story forward a little bit. Okay. So Sophie's manager actually does notice some of the challenges that Sophie's described. He notices her sort of struggling a little bit. So he gently asks her if she'd like some support. Now, Sophie disclosed that she thought she may be neurodivergent, specifically autistic. So Sophie's manager refers her for a workplace needs assessment. Importantly, not to diagnose her, but to better understand what's going to help Sophie in her role to be more comfortable, more productive, more able to be herself. And importantly, Sophie recognizes that this was the first time that someone's actually asked me what I need at work without actually expecting me to justify it. Okay, and that's important because a workplace needs assessment isn't about confirming or even identifying a label. It's about understanding a need. It's tailored to the individual, their role, their environment, and it should be person-centered. It should look at all elements. As a workplace needs assessor, I've learned that actually labels can be useful, but they can also be quite misleading. If I know that I'm going to be working with someone with ADHD, for example, I don't actually know anything about that particular person and that particular role. What's important as a workplace needs assessor is that we identify where the areas of support are needed. So actually the labels are almost unimportant. Okay. Let's have a little bit of a slightly deeper dive into what do we mean when we keep talking about a workplace needs assessment. Deb's going to tell us a little bit about that.
Thank you. So just building really on what Mark has already said from his expertise, it's important, as Mark said, it's not a medical assessment. It sounds very formal, a workplace needs assessment. The minute you use the word assessment, it does sound like there is a element of diagnostic or kind of judgment within the process. And as Mark said, it's not about kind of diagnosing or treating or, or identifying even a health condition. Understanding that individual's needs, and specifically that individual's needs in the context of the environment that they work in, and crucially turning that insight into practical jobs specific solutions that help that individual in their role. The approach it should be a holistic process, looking at the whole person in the context of the environment that they find themselves in. It's a tailored approach, as Mark suggested, so it's beyond kind of labels. It's about need and looking at what can be done in those areas of need. But there's also an element of providing a detailed explanation of the strengths and also the challenges experienced by the employee in their role, and providing, I guess, that explanation, that, if you like, learning piece to the manager who's reading this report. So it helps to provide some insight potentially to the manager who actually, I might not know much about what's going on with this individual in terms of their unique strengths and their challenges. So there's an education piece and a learning piece within it as well. As we mentioned, it's highly contextual, so it examines all areas of the individual in their role. So what are the tasks that make up their job? What are the tools they use? Assistive technology, paper, pens, whatever it is that we use in our job on a day-to-day basis. What are these tools that are working or not working? What are the people that are within our job sphere that we interact with? So it considers all the kind of different elements around the individual and considers all different types of adjustments as well. Crucially, it's practical, so it's forward thinking. It makes suggestions for appropriate adjustments given an understanding of the context and the individual's specific circumstances and needs. And crucially, justification. There is a big piece of a workplace needs assessment that is around justification. It's not just around what adjustments one would recommend as an assessor, but why this adjustment and not another one. So there's an element of that report of this document, that should clearly explain why an adjustment has been suggested and potentially why not another one, and how this adjustment may support that employee in their role. So with that, Mark, I'm sorry, Mark, Mark's going to be talking now about the benefits of that workplace needs assessment.
Yeah, and there are many, many benefits of a well-conducted and implemented workplace needs assessment, and not just for the employee, but for the employer as well. But from the employee's perspective, for Sophie, the assessment was a turning point. It gave her the language, it gave her a voice to actually talk about her strengths and barriers. And it's interesting because as an assessor, I mean, many times people have said, well, look, this is the first time anybody's actually asked me. This is the first time I've had a chance to talk about this. And it can be a really massive thing. It gives confidence. All that feeds into that individual's well-being. Actually, just actually going through that workplace needs assessment process is a massive boost to a person's well-being. You can feel heard. Having someone who will sit there and let you tell them about your work, your role, the areas that you're good at, the areas you could do with a bit of support at, is massive. You feel supported, you feel heard, you feel like the organisation genuinely wants to support you here. Okay, and obviously, ultimately, it's about helping you perform in your role. It's about helping you to have the tools, the mechanisms to be as productive as you can be. Creates a sense of belonging. You're working for an organization that actually genuinely does care enough to ask you about these things. All that leads to reduced anxiety, increased confidence. Sophie mentioned early on that she felt that she had to mask quite a lot. All of this helps reduce some of that overload, if you like. So massive advantages and benefits for the employee, but also for the employer as well, as Deb's going to tell us.
So yeah, so for the employer, why have a workplace needs assessment? Why commission one? What essentially for the business, what's in it essentially for the business, for the manager? What are they going to gain from this process? So these are some potential benefits that we see in our practice. So that employer, gets that kind of clear, expert, comprehensive guidance from potentially a third party, whether that's access to work, as we said, an occupational health provider or a workplace adjustment provider. And that third party is impartial. It's not it's impartial in the sense that one is taking on board the employee's situation and their needs, but also in the context of the employer's situation and their resources and the environment as well. And so I would say a good workplace needs assessment, a core function of it, if you like, is to support both the individual on their journey, but also the manager or the broader organisation in terms of coming together and finding adjustments that work for all, essentially. A workplace needs assessment should also help employers to understand what adjustments are available and how they can best support their employee. So rather than it being, this is something you can do, there is a justification for that potential recommendation and also suggestions about how you might implement those adjustments. Of course, it helps organisations to meet legal obligations under the Equality Act 2010 to support those staff with disabilities, long-term health conditions, including mental health difficulties, neurodifferences, and physical impairments. So we would argue that it's vital in ensuring that those employees that we essentially can perform our roles to the best of our abilities. As Mark said, I think at the beginning, at some point in our lives, we will experience disablement, disability, however we want to call it, to term it. And so, if this is in place, that is a great thing. It can also support, as Mark said, of course, the employees' productivity and morale, and that's going to kind of feed into the wider team, the organisation. And of course, as a tool potentially for the organisation to demonstrate their commitment to inclusion and equality as well. So there are just some benefits that we hear our employers talking about once they've gone through that workplace needs assessment journey with their employees. But of course, workplace needs assessments, as we said earlier, aren't the only way of recommending, delivering potentially adjustments. And so Mark's going to now talk about the other ways of recommending adjustments.
Yeah, so as we said, workplace needs assessments are not the only approach to this. There are other approaches, and we're just going to have a quick look at probably the main ones that we tend to come across. Triage can be a really useful first step, if you like. literally first aid. So a workplace needs assessment with the best will in the world takes some organising. It's in depth. A triage system can be a nice, quick way of just getting some support where it's needed quickly. It can also sometimes be all that's needed. If an employee, if a person actually understands their strengths and where they might need some support, or have done a similar role previously, they may come with the knowledge of exactly what they need in order to be at their best. And a triage might be just the answer that they need. Alternatively, a triage may just allow that person to continue in their role until we can take a deeper look. Psychometric assessment tools. We're increasingly seeing lots and lots of online tools that a person can sit down and work through on their own. And the idea of lots of these tools is that they help that individual identify their strengths, and sort of suggest strategies, if you like, for working to those strengths. And that's also really, really great. Some challenges with that: it is entirely employee-led. Sometimes an employee needs help finding a voice, if you like, needs help sort of verbalizing or clarifying thoughts around these things. But tends to focus on strengths, and by its very nature, it tends not to spend a lot of time sort of investigating and exploring adjustments that might be needed, for example, in the environment, working practices, assistive technology, etc., etc. There's access to work. Sure, you're all familiar with access to work. Access to work is great. We're very, very lucky in this country to have such a scheme. But there are some challenges with access to work. Generally speaking, around sort of lead times and so on, it can be quite a lengthy process. It can be quite a challenging process. The other thing to just bear in mind with access to work as well is that its reason for being, if you like, is to support employers with the cost of implementing adjustments. And so that's mainly why assessments from access to work tend to focus around adjustments that have a cost, if you like. As an employer, you're still expected to look at all adjustments. And then we've got the traditional workplace needs assessment, which is what our friend Sophie has undertaken. Workplace needs assessments tend to be a little bit more robust, generally speaking. They help the employee to tell their story. They're sharing the space with someone, with an assessor, that can help facilitate that, and make that process a lot more personable, if you like. It explores in depth the individual situation and circumstances, that person's specific role. What are the expectations on in that role? How are they measured? How is their performance measured? What are their areas of strength? Where are their areas of challenge? All those sorts of things. And crucially, the end of the process provides the employer with a really detailed narrative, if you like, with some suggestions, but also explaining how we've arrived at those suggestions for adjustments. Okay, and that can also be really, really powerful for an employer. Now, each model has a place. In our case, for Sophie, that tailored, human-centered approach was essential. And Deb's going to tell us a little bit about why.
So why was a workplace needs assessment so useful for Sophie? So for Sophie, it gave her a unique kind of space to explore her strengths and challenges. As Mark said, this can be the first time that an individual has had that space to do that, particularly if they're on this workplace adjustment journey for the first time. Sophie may have, well, she has had a recent kind of self-realization, if you like, or self-identification that she feels that she may be autistic. So this is really the first time that she's been able to have those conversations potentially with somebody, and crucially somebody that isn't within the organisation as well. But it could be, for example, that an employee like Sophie is having challenges in their role, new challenges. There may be a trigger that's happened in their life outside of work. One could have had a baby, there could have been a bereavement, there could actually be changes, of course, within work in terms of a new manager or a new role restructuring. So all of these things can have an impact on an individual who has potentially developed strategies over the years, has learned to quote unquote mask or camouflage some of their ways of being. And then these changes mean that, suddenly they're not able to, one isn't able to function in the way they were before. So it can be these moments of friction where a workplace needs assessment can also be very, very beneficial. An employee may have a very complex role where they are juggling many different plates, but also there are many demands on them from different parts of the organization. And so one adjustment may actually not be enough. We may need to look at, the bigger picture of what's going on. Really also beneficial. This is more so for the employer, but obviously has a benefit for the employee. But, if the employer isn't sure of what support exists or what they can do, so there is willingness and they want to, but actually they don't want just here's a list of adjustments or what would you like? Sophie may not know what she needs. She may not have gone down this journey before, as we know. And also the employer may not be sure about what may be useful for that individual. They may know about a potential range of adjustments, but actually, how impactful are they going to be? How potentially, quote unquote, reasonable are they going to be? How practical are they going to be? So these are the kind of questions that a workplace needs assessment will help that manager to answer, and ultimately it will benefit that individual. Sophie.
A question that we often get asked by clients is given the various options and alternatives that exist, do we still need workplace needs assessments? And it's a fair question, because on the face of it, some of the alternatives can look like easier fixes, if you like. But actually, the answer is still yes. We do still need workplace needs assessments. It may not be our first port of call, but certainly for more complex cases, as Deb was explaining, there is most definitely still a need for a traditional holistic workplace needs assessment. But to fully realise all of the advantages that a workplace needs assessment can bring to the table, okay, it needs to be followed through. It needs to be implemented appropriately. So perhaps a better question is actually, are we using workplace needs assessments well? Okay. Deb's going to tell us a quote from actually our CEO, which I think sums that up quite nicely.
Yes. So Mark and I, as I mentioned earlier, we have been talking about this for some time, the value of a workplace needs assessment. What are the different ways of delivering adjustments? Where's the future of adjustments, essentially? And out of that, we've written a blog that will come to you after this session, which is titled Why Workplace Needs Assessments Still Belong in Your Adjustment Strategy. But as part of that process, we spoke to Ben, who's our CEO, about where he sees the value of adjustments. And a quote that we pulled out from the wider blog, so please do go away and read the blog in full, and I wouldn't want to quote Ben out of context, of course, but a particularly meaningful section was around his quote that, the workplace needs assessment is only as useful as the system around it. And I think, that system is very potentially large. What does it encompass? The organization, the culture, the process, the policy, the people. to make sure that it's not just a kind of tick box exercise, to ensure that that workplace needs assessment report doesn't just sit on a hard drive and not get implemented. So on that, we're going to move quite nicely, hopefully, onto, implementing those adjustments. So what is that system potentially that we're talking about that needs to be in place, and how can we overcome those barriers and offer solutions as well?
Yeah. So what are some of those barriers that can get in the way of implementing a workplace needs assessment effectively? And they are many and they are varied. But for example, let's take the Sophie's manager's perspective. Some of the potential barriers that he might have experienced are unclear budget processes, and this is something that comes up quite a lot. Some adjustments do require a budget. Where does that budget live? Do we have a special adjustment budget? Does it live with our people and culture department? Does it live with the team's budget? Where is that money coming from? Pathways, are they known? Are they clear? Does Sophie and does Sophie's manager know that actually the organisation has an assessment pathway, has a support route? Many's the time where organisations will have really good policies in place and really, really good processes, but if they're not shared, if they're not made available, they don't get used. Things like IT landscape. Increasingly now we live in an age where technology can help us with many of the challenges that we experience. But technology is complicated. What's our organization's policy on introducing new software? Is it compatible? What about data protection? All of these are big, scary questions. The manager's own confidence and knowledge. Sophie was quite fortunate because Sophie's manager actually approached her and gently had a conversation with her. That takes a degree of skill and confidence to be able to do that. We make that really difficult. For example, the language that we use, the language around neurodiversity is rife with pitfalls and potholes, okay? Managers need the confidence to be able to navigate that. Reasonable adjustments. The word reasonable is really important when we talk about adjustments. What is reasonable? Does Sophie's manager understand what reasonable means? Does he have the authority to make the decision on reasonable? And I think, as we've sort of said before, very often adjustments are the easy part of the process. Okay, the difficult part for organisations is creating an environment where people feel safe and comfortable actually asking for support in the first place. That's crucial in all of this, and very often that conversation doesn't happen until people are at the sort of the latter end of a performance improvement plan, for example. If we could create an environment where that was a normal conversation to have at the beginning, it would save an awful lot of time and expense and stress and worry. The other thing that comes up quite a lot is something we call adjustment envy, where colleagues say, well, hang on a minute, how come they get that? I want that as well, okay? And as a manager, for example, you've got to manage that. And that could be particularly challenging if the employee with the special treatment actually doesn't want to share. Managers have to be equipped and able to deal with all of these things. So there's quite a lot there. So there are also lots of things that an organisation can do to help mitigate some of these barriers, to help reduce them, even to help remove them. And although those things are going to look very different for different organisations, let's have a look at some examples of what those solutions may look like. So Deb's going to take us through a few to start with.
Thanks, Mark. So as we mentioned earlier, the workplace needs assessment is only as useful, as valuable as the system around it. So we've put together, for want of a better word, a checklist to help us kind of navigate this journey from workplace needs assessment, from the ask the conversation all the way through to implementation. Really to ensure that any recommendations that are made don't just kind of gather dust. It is a checklist. It is not intended to be a kind of reductive exercise. We're by no means suggesting that it's an easy process that can just be ticked off a list. But on the other side, we wanted to provide a guide, just some indicative things to think about when you're going through this process. But of course, we recognise, of course, that every organisation, excuse me, every individual, of course, is different. So please take what's useful and ignore what isn't useful for your particular context. But yes, a couple of things to think about, drawing on what Mark's already mentioned, process and systems. Is there a clear budget process for adjustments? And does the manager know where that budget sits? Is it a departmental budget? Is it a centralised budget? Sometimes these budgets come directly, potentially from health and safety. Whether it should or should not is another question. Is it an HR budget? Is it purely access to work? All of those questions that joined up kind of thinking needs thinking through and then communicated to the manager. Do managers know the referral route for support? You could have an organisation with fantastic resources, partners, training, all of these great things, but they're all existing in silos, in bubbles. So it's really important that obviously they're joined up, but that the manager knows what is the kind of route through that. And on the joining up theme, is IT or facilities management, are they kind of joined up with HR? So what's the process? This is where potentially an adjustment policy as part of a wider disability neurodiversity policy can be useful, because it will clarify what is the process, who goes where and for what and why. And, is there a review date agreed for that after the workplace needs assessment? At what point are you going to be reviewing it, and when, crucially? Is it part of a kind of annual review? Is it more often than that? But just being very clear about when that happens so everyone else can be clear. The next piece, as Mark said, is around manager confidence, which is such a big area. This says, has the manager been briefed on the recommendations? So what is the follow through after the delivery of that report? What happens to the manager and to that report? Or are they just kind of left with this report and we don't know what to do with it, essentially? Does the manager understand what reasonable means in this context? And that might be a broader piece around the training and support that managers receive in order to understand reasonableness and also to have those conversations. And lastly, are they confident to talk openly with the employee? And if not, what do we as an organisation need to do to support that manager's confidence in what can be quite a complex conversation?
What other areas can we be thinking about? So the employee's involvement. After all, this process is for the employee first and foremost. So has the employee had a chance to shape and agree those adjustments? We should always be doing adjustments with employees, not to employees. It's really important that the employee gets their say. And again, that's one of the sort of the built-in tenets, if you like, of a workplace needs assessment. Does that employee feel heard and supported? Are there safe spaces for ongoing feedback? This is really, really important as well. With the best will in the world, workplace needs assessors only get a very small insight into the working day of an individual and an organisation. So adjustments that are made are always made in good faith, but they may not always have the best picture. So is there a mechanism for reviewing how an adjustment is going? Does that employee feel able to say, I know you might have spent a little bit of money on this piece of software, but honestly, it's really not helping me in the way that we hoped it would. Okay, is that able to happen? Are there regular reviews and sit downs? Culture and communication. Yeah, we've talked a lot about sort of the culture of an organisation. What is the language? How do we talk about adjustments in this organisation? Are they productivity tools, or are they advantages that we give to certain people? Okay, what is the language that we use around this? Um, are they normal? Do lots of people have adjustments? Are they visible, or is it something quite exceptional and quite unusual? Do colleagues understand the difference between equity and equality? This is a really, really big one, and it speaks a lot to that um, adjustment envy that we mentioned a little bit earlier on. We want, as an organisation, to help each one of our employees to be as comfortable and productive as they can be. And the very nature of that means we have to support people in different ways. That's the basis of equity, if you like. But if people don't understand that, it can also lead to conflict and demotivation and so on and so forth. So actually helping employees to understand that is really, really important. Are adjustments treated as part of everyday inclusion and not one-off exceptions? As I said before, how do we view these adjustments? Is it something that as an organisation we're used to doing, as an employee, as a team member? Yep, quite used to people being supported in ways that they need it. And do you know what? That's great, because although I don't need anything at the moment, there's a really good chance that at some point I may. And it's nice to know that actually I will be met where I need to be met, if that makes sense. Okay. So all of these things build into this picture, if you like, and they all help reduce and sometimes actually remove some of those barriers that we were talking about before. But of course, it's also important to recognise that just as we talk about people being unique individual, organisations are also unique and individual, and that's one of the reasons why neurobox, we make quite a big deal that when supporting, partnering with clients, our approach is always tailored to meet you wherever you're at, if you like. Okay, so just keeping an eye on the time. I'm sure you all want to know what happened with Sophie in the end. Okay, and I promise we will tell you. Right, but first of all, we'd just like to invite you to sort of share your thoughts and ask any questions. I can see that some people have already been putting some questions in that Q&A window. That's amazing. Thank you for that. So yeah, let's move over to questions. There we go. I had a horrible moment there where I clicked on it and nothing happened, but we're all good now. So, shall we have a look at a couple of the questions that are in that chat?
Yeah,
Okay.
great.
Let's have a look. So, Patricia, thank you for your question. You said even if you're given a grant from Access to Work, it doesn't mean you'll get the adjustment or support. 11 months after being told I would get Access to Work, I still have not received most of the things. Why is Access to Work not mandatory? The employer can get away with giving excuses for 11 months. I think I might now lose what IAS provided for me to stay in work. I feel completely burnt out and feel like working out from work. I feel for you, Patricia, and I'm sorry that's your experience at the moment. That must be incredibly tough and frustrating for you. Deb, do you mind if I give some thoughts on that?
No, please do. I'll feed in as well.
Thank you. So it is an interesting one because ultimately it's the employer's responsibility and duty to make reasonable adjustments. And the way the system is configured at the moment is simply that Access to Work cannot dictate what an organisation is required to deem as reasonable. And there are reasons for that, and some of those reasons are quite good, because what is considered reasonable is informed by many, many things, okay? And many of those factors aren't immediately visible in a 2 hour workplace needs assessment, let alone an access to work needs assessment. So it is always down to the employer. So if the reason that some of those adjustments haven't been implemented is because the employer doesn't deem them reasonable, okay, that can happen. But in our experience, more likely adjustments haven't been implemented because of some of the other barriers that we've talked about, because there's some software that's recommended that won't work with something, or we don't know how we feel about this artificial intelligence tool that's been suggested. These are the sorts of things that very often get in the way of it. And yeah, it exactly speaks to what we're saying. So thank you, Patricia. These adjustments are only as useful as the systems around them. Okay. I do hope it gets better for you.
Yes, thank you, Patricia, for sharing that. And we're sorry that that's been your experience, and it's the experience of many, many people. I'm sure that doesn't necessarily help, um, but we are in relatively regular contact with Access to Work, and we know that there will be changes, and of course we hope that those changes will have a positive impact on all of us that are Access to Work users. It's difficult. It's not, I guess, our role in in this talk to kind of offer advice, not knowing the individual circumstances. It's very easy for me to sit here and Mark too to say, are you able to have a conversation with your manager or employer about looking at other routes that aren't Access to Work at the moment? Because ultimately, if the barriers with Access to Work are going to mean that you can't work, then the employer still has a duty to implement adjustments, whether that's funded through Access to Work or not. Obviously, for the employer, it makes sense to fund it through Access to Work because they may not have the budget, but ultimately it's their role to keep you in work through those adjustments. So if you are able to have that conversation or to bring someone in to help you to have that conversation, to look at what adjustments they can do, what adjustments may be possible that actually don't have a cost. These are all the things to think about in the current system that we're kind of operating within.
And also just to add into that finally, Patricia, if you think it might help, feel free to share our contact information. We'll happily have a conversation and help where we can.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, absolutely.
Christina, you've asked which online psychometric assessments would you recommend? That's an interesting question. I'm not sure how to answer that, Deb.
Excuse me. Oh, the light's just gone on. Maybe that means we can help. No. I think the fact that you've asked that question in itself is fascinating because it suggests, as we've said, that these online psychometric assessments are out there and they're in the world and they have a value. It's not our place to recommend one over the other, I would say, generally. I would say have a look if there are reviews, if there are kind of free ways of trying them out. I would kind of go down that option. I would say also it's a highly personal thing. So just get a feel from, let's say, the website. Excuse me, if you feel that the language and the approach aligns with you and makes you feel comfortable, then go with that one as well. Obviously, if it has some form of validation by an occupational psychologist as well, that's important, well, crucial really. So yeah, I think if it's a quote unquote trusted source that that you feel comfortable with, that's what I would. Those are the kind of questions that I would think of. If I was choosing one.
Brilliant. Thank you, Deb. I'm just looking at the time, Deb. Do you think
Mm.
we've got time to look at a couple of the questions that we've been asked previously?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
We
let
can take a
me.
little whistle stop tour so that hopefully everyone can have some lunch before before the next meeting begins. Yeah, absolutely. So these were some frequently asked questions that come up frequently. That's why they're called frequently asked questions. But thinking about Sophie's case, it does highlight a number of these questions that we get quite often. And so one of them is around, what if I'm a manager, a supervisor, a team leader, and I can see that an employee is struggling. I mean, first of all, the fact that you can see that, it says a lot potentially about you as a line manager, because you have that level of insight and perception about somebody's, what's going on with an individual, which is great. But what if I notice that they're struggling, and I think there may be a reason for these challenges, which may be disability or neurodiversity related, but they haven't shared that with me. So what can I do as a manager? So Mark, I'm your manager, well, not your manager, but I'm a manager, and I'm coming to you and I'm saying, help me, essentially.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's one that comes up quite often. Managers identify that a team member may be struggling, finding challenges with certain things, and maybe they have an understanding of disability and neurodiversity and recognize some traits. How, as a manager, do you approach that when the employee isn't saying anything or isn't even actually asking for any support? And it is a difficult one. Um, Probably what I wouldn't do as a manager is take the sort of the direct approach, if you like. And I've just done an awareness course on ADHD, and mate, you are so ADHD. Probably not that approach. A better approach is very often to actually not think in terms of labels or disabilities at all. Okay, approach it purely from a support perspective, and it might be something along the lines of, I've noticed that with these types of tasks, you seem to need a bit more time. You seem to be a little bit more concerned about the output. Is there anything we can do to make this easier for you? Make it a support conversation rather than a labels-based conversation, if you like. But yeah, it ain't easy. It's really not easy. And very often managers, people leaders are just expected to know how to do this.
Thank you, Mark. I really love this idea of actually taking it out of the conversation around a label and normalizing that conversation as part of regular one-to-ones. And just to throw in, it could be that as a manager, a team leader, is there a potential for a collective conversation around strengths and challenges in a safe space, but that isn't personal, of course, but it's just about things. These are the things that I think I enjoy with my role, that I find really easy. These are the sticking points, kind of thing, so that you're framing it in that way. And in that way, you might also kind of capture some of those people that actually do want to share, and that might help other people share too, potentially.
Yeah, that's a
Thank
great
you,
point.
Mark. So the next question that we get a lot is, what if, as a manager, as an organization, what if I think a recommendation in a workplace needs assessment seems unreasonable?
Okay, so what if I think a recommendation seems unreasonable? So this and also this speaks to the final question as well. What if an employee thinks something is reasonable and the organisation doesn't? This question
Mm.
around reasonableness is a big one. Okay, and it's entirely likely and happens fairly frequently that there are disagreements, if you like, around what's reasonable and unreasonable. Ultimately, it is the organisation's responsibility to decide what's reasonable and unreasonable. But we are allowed to work around it and work with it. Okay, so what is it that's making that suggestion unreasonable? Is it the adjustment? Is it the suggestion itself? Is it the system that we built around it? What actually makes it hard? So, for example, if a recommendation for an adjustment is that actually an employee gets to work from home more frequently than would normally be allowed. Okay, but actually the organisation says, well, no, we can't do that. We think that's unreasonable because actually it's important that this particular group of people come together and meet as a team at least 3 times a week. Okay, that's a business need, and we believe that that is a reasonable need. Okay, fine. So how do we approach that? Well, I think the first thing that we need to do is include the employee in these conversations and decisions. Explain the challenge that we're having with this particular adjustment. let's look at alternative solutions. And it's interesting because that very often doesn't happen, but we spend a lot of time explaining that people with neuro differences, whether that's ADHD or autism, are very often quite creative thinkers, can solve problems quite creatively. Why would we exclude them from this conversation? Um, it might well be that actually, yes, do you know what? Working from home in this case is not going to be doable. But let's look at actually why that adjustment was recommended, and let's dig into the reason why. And for example, in the case of Sophie, Sophie feels she might be autistic. She may, as an autistic person, find it really challenging to navigate the rush hour traffic in the morning. Catching the train and the bus and the tube, or even just driving in the rush hour traffic, may be really, really challenging for her, maybe exhausting for her. So actually, it's quite a reasonable thing to suggest that she does that less often. But actually, maybe there's another way. What if we looked at Sophie's working hours? What if she didn't come in at rush hour but came in at 10:30 instead? So that actually she didn't have to navigate that. Would that make it more doable for Sophie? So it's really about exploring around these adjustments rather than just saying, nope, can't do that. Okay. But yeah, it's a challenge. It's a challenge, but we need to involve people. We need to be transparent, and we need to be curious about how we approach these things. Good. Um, have we left? Yeah, we've got to. So we promised to tell you about Sophie and what happened. Okay, so I think we've just left enough time. So Deb, do you want to tell everybody what happened with Sophie?
Yes, sure. It's quite a nice way to round off our time together. So, yeah, where's Sophie now? So, 6 months on, Sophie is doing really well. She's working flexibly. She's using the assistive technology that was recommended, and she's got a team buddy as well. Um, and crucially, she's not the only one that is happy. The manager says the manager can recognize that she's doing some of her best work ever, and of course that helps the manager and the wider team as well. So I guess the key takeaway from the story, from Sophie's story, is that nobody is in any way suggesting that this workplace needs assessment is a kind of magic bullet, that it's a kind of quick fix solution, but essentially it has the potential to be a catalyst for change. But ultimately, what kind of made the difference for Sophie and the manager was having the ability to act on those recommendations to put them in place. And I just wanted to say that I just seen that we do have another question from I think Della that's come up, and we unfortunately are out of time. But Della and anybody else on the call, if you would like to reach out to us, and if you have any follow-on questions, we'd be pleased to have those discussions with you. So hopefully either Mark or I can put our email addresses in the chat. I think I found it. But yeah, all that's sort of left from us to say thank you very much for listening to us for nearly an hour now. I'd love to connect outside of the meeting, so please do get in touch. And yeah, we'll put our email addresses in the chat function now for you.
Yeah, and perhaps we could also say that, as this is sort of on a LinkedIn platform, again, feel free to sort of message us in LinkedIn as well with any questions or suggestions or anything else. But
Yes, please do connect.
yeah, thank you for listening to us for an hour. I'm going to go and have something to eat and a cup of tea now.
Me too. With some sugar, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So again, enjoy the rest of your day, everybody, and it's been great to meet you. Thank you.
Bye.